now we're going to talk about FrameNet annotation. And as I said, lexicographic annotation is the core work of FrameNet. In lexicographic annotation, we choose good examples that illustrate the use of each word, of each lexical unit. In full text annotation, every word in a text is analyzed. As it happens, good examples are also easy to annotate. What we think of as a good example is a simple active sentence where all of the core frame elements are instantiated. You don't have to do a lot of thinking to figure out which constituent instantiates which core frame element. In full text annotation, sometimes it happened that words that needed to be annotated didn't yet exist in the FrameNet database in some already defined frame. So you can imagine that that would be more time consuming, because if an annotator comes across a word that doesn't exist in the FrameNet database, or if it exists in the database but in a different frame from the frame that's that's exhibited in the text, the annotator has to start the whole process of defining a frame, getting good examples, what other words belong in that frame, what does it look like in the corpus, and so on. So while FrameNet manual annotation is a very time-consuming process, full text annotation is even more time-consuming. With that little introduction about the nature of the process of full text annotation, we'll have a short digression to see what that looks like when it's actually done. Not the whole process, but what the results look like. So, for the most part, FrameNet used full text annotation to demonstrate the contribution of frame semantics to text understanding. The first part of the process is obviously either to be given a text or to choose a text. More often than not, FrameNet back to full text annotation. FrameNet uses full text annotation to demonstrate the contribution of frame semantics to text understanding. The first part is to choose or be given a text to annotate. More often than not, FrameNet was asked to annotate a text for an organization or a company that was interested in some natural language processing application for which they believed, and we hoped that was the case, that they could benefit from frame semantic annotation on the text for their natural language processing application, such as question answering or machine translation. But that's the kind of natural language processing application for which FrameNet data would be useful. Okay, so get the text, run a named entity recognizer, because after all, proper nouns, named entities, are not framily interesting, right? So we need to identify that they're in the text, but we don't need to do any annotation with respect to them. Identify the LUs, and then identify the frame to which the LU belongs with the likelihood that the annotator is going to find LUs that don't exist in the database, for which they're going to have to define a new frame, go through the whole process of looking at corpora, figuring out what the LUs are, figuring out what the other frame elements are. Okay, so the next slide shows you what that looks like when it's done. I realize you can't see the small print, but I've indicated the relevant pieces, and you can, of course, go to the FrameNet website and look at this and see not just what it looks like, but what kind of information is provided. So the yellow highlighting indicates that that's a named entity. Something that's a named entity might end up being a frame element. It might end up as a part of a constituent that's a semantic role in the appropriate frame. The target LUs are in capital letters and highlighted in blue, also because they are clickable links. And the next slide is going to show you what you can click to when you click on a target LU. And to the right of the target LU is the name of the frame for which it's annotated. Okay, so in the next slide, again, I know you can't see the actual words, but you can see what's been annotated. So I clicked on the word interest right at the top. It's the first blue LU in this particular little piece of text. And in the lower pane, what I got is the frame semantic annotation for that target LU in the sentence. Okay? Now, since we're doing full text annotation, another word in the same sentence could well be a target LU. And if I click that word, I'll see annotation for that LU. And that could be a totally different frame, and most likely is a totally different frame. So the software allows you to choose which sentence, which LU in the sentence to look at. And as you look at the different LUs in each sentence, you can remove them from the lower pane to start looking at new ones. You also have the ability to look at the frame definition through this, right? You have to click again and then go to the frame definition. So it's really a nice, I think it's a wonderful display, also to get an idea what full text annotation looks like and how much information it provides. So that's going to be it for full text annotation until next week, later in the week, pretty late in Michael's tenure here. But you'll have the opportunity to do that as well. Okay, so now we're going back to so-called easy lexicographic annotation. And I say so-called because only in the perfect example sentence that illustrates the well-defined and easy-to-grasp frame is any annotation really ever easy. But there's some annotation that's a lot easier than other annotations. So this is the easy stuff. Yesterday we looked at attaching, and that's a relatively easy frame to characterize and a relatively easy frame for frame semantic annotation. We're going to look at something a little more difficult today, not only because we looked at attaching yesterday, but you have the written document about how to go step by step through attaching. So I wanted to give you something more challenging. We know about the process of annotation. Remember, the goal is to to develop the valence description for each LU that's annotated, and to provide the actual annotated sentences with the semantico-syntactic mapping. What constituents instantiate what frame elements, what semantic roles. So we're going to have to figure out what frame any LU is in, or we have an idea of a frame that we want to develop. We need to know what LUs belong in that frame. We have to define the frame elements. We have to figure out which constituents instantiate each element. So first, choose a frame. And you want to think about what event, situation, entity, or relationship you want to characterize. I think in the early stages of frame development, working on event frames or situation frames would probably be easier than starting with a relationship frame such as locative relation. For collecting your words, you want to think about what words in the language belong to the frame that you want to characterize. In frame semantics, we talk about words evoking frames. Evoking frames. So you need some linguistic material to help you characterize the situation in which that word is going to be used, right? It doesn't happen, okay, I'm going to sit and think about some possible frame. No. As linguists, we're looking at language. Yesterday we talked about some of the things we might also be worrying about. In particular, polysemy. Language is full of ambiguity, lexical and other, and words have multiple meanings. So polysemy, it's the pivot of semantic analysis, and we already worried about this notion of word. So we're not committed to limiting our investigation to that which occurs between two blank spaces. So how about revenge? The first thing we want to do is talk about the concept in general. We want to think about what happens in a revenge situation or during an act of revenge. You have at least two individuals involved. Let's call them A and B for now. A does something to harm or hurt B. B takes action to harm A in turn. And importantly, B acts independently of any legal or other institutional setting. What are some of the words, some of the lexical units that would be part of the revenge frame, of a revenge frame? We have verbs such as avenge, revenge, retaliate, get back, get even, pay back. We have nouns, revenge, vengeance, reprisal, retaliation, and adjectives, vengeful, vindictive. All of these words conjure up, evoke a situation where someone is taking revenge on someone else. Let's look at some possible examples, because these examples have instances of some of the verbs that I mentioned previously. The first sentence, Fabio paid back the money that he owed to his grandfather. Pay back, right? We had pay back in our list of words. Vittoria retaliated against her boss for being dismissed by leaving with the office keys. Mariana got even more gifts than she expected for her birthday. Which sentence belongs to the revenge frame? Yes? Second one, good. The examples that I gave you are pretty blatantly not part of the revenge frame. And that, I did that deliberately so that you can see that there can be a vast difference between examples that you're looking at to determine whether that's a good example of your frame, and those that you know are good examples. Most of the time, of course, FrameNet lexicographers are trying to identify sentences that have much more subtle distinctions, right? As soon as you see Fabio paid back the money, the money didn't figure into our very loose description of what happens in revenge. Mariana got even more gifts. Getting anything didn't have anything to do with our frame. Okay, those are really blatant examples of what we call, well, of what's not in frame. A sentence that does belong to this frame we talk about as being in frame. In frame. That's a term that came up in the course of our work. We talk about in-frame examples and out-of-frame examples, right? So the question that you want to ask at this point is, what are the roles? Remember that we are thinking about A does something to harm B, B takes action to harm A in return, and B acts independently of any setting. Okay? So, at the very least, in our sentence, we know that someone did something in turn, right? Someone was harmed, someone did the harming, there's the harm itself, and the thing that was done in turn, right? This really is a clumsy way to talk about it, but it's what we have. It does the job. And at this point, we're not yet interested in clever names. We're interested in teasing apart and figuring out what's involved. Who are the participants? What are the props? What other conceptual roles must be characterized to characterize the frame? Okay. Now comes the beginning of an answer to Bruno's question yesterday about naming frame elements. We want to develop a descriptive vocabulary for the participants, props, and other conceptual roles of the frame elements, right? I could call the frame elements banana, potato, orange. That's not going to help me remember what those roles are, right? I want to choose names that are mnemonic for the role, right? That's the basic idea. Okay, now we get to a little nicer looking definition. Let's call that the informal definition of the revenge frame. Because of an injury to an injured person who is important to an avenger, possibly himself or herself, the avenger inflicts a punishment on the offender, the person responsible for the injury. Notice that this informal definition also is not beautifully crafted. But again, that's not the goal. The goal here is to make sure to characterize the situation in terms of all of its concepts. Now let's name the frame elements. I hinted at what they might be in my informal definition, and of course in crafting my informal definition, I'm thinking about what these participants are doing and what kinds of words might help me remember who they are and what they're doing, right? So let's identify the person who acts in turn as the avenger. Let's call the person who was harmed the injured party. Let's call the harm that was done the injury. Let's call the person who did the harming the offender. And let's call that which was done in turn the punishment. Notice that we choose names that are specific to the frame, and we're not drawing from a standard list of thematic role names. We don't think that's useful. Not the least of which is because we would need many more thematic roles than are in the standard list. Alternatively, we would have to create mappings between what we understand to be the roles and the standard list of thematic roles. And then, of course, we'd have to remember what the mappings were. So just calling everything an agent, or everything a theme, or everything a patient is not very useful from our perspective. Of course, there are cases when we use the same label that occurs on the list of thematic roles. In some cases, instrument is the very best label to give to a frame element. It fits that frame, right? So we're not opposed to using those particular words. We just don't believe that they are the be-all and end-all of semantic roles. Okay, so now let's look at our sentence, our in-frame sentence again. And we have labeled Vittoria as the avenger. In this case, Vittoria is also the injured party. That's nice. It could be that somebody avenging something for someone else who was injured. And then we would need to identify that, but that's not the case in this sentence. Against her boss is the constituent that instantiates the offender, right? It's the constituent that instantiates that frame element. In the real world, the person who is the offender is her boss. But in this sentence, it's the constituent that we're labeling. For being dismissed is the offense. By leaving with the office keys is the punishment. Of course, one has to take the perspective of the avenger to accept the idea that leaving with the office keys is the punishment, right? From her perspective, she's punishing him, right? You get the idea, though, right? And this is important because, again, remember the notion of perspective. This is the avenger's perspective. The avenger is punishing the offender, right? Okay, so now let's go back and look at more in-frame examples. Kind of similar in surface structure to the ones that were out of frame, but different in important ways. We have our original in-frame example. Now we can think about Fabio paid back the man who broke the window by ignoring him. Right? Do we see the difference? So we understand, and this speaks to your question about valence description, right? So for payback in the revenge frame, we know that the object of payback is going to be an offender, right? So money, although the constituent, the money, is a grammatical object, it's not an offender. And that's the point about mapping frame elements to grammatical functions. Today is the day of technical difficulties. Okay, at least it didn't happen on the first day. Now let's look at the third sentence. Mariana got even with the man who damaged her car. As it happens, the verb get even requires a prepositional phrase afterwards. That's part of the valence description of get even in the revenge frame. Okay. Oops, I think I repeated a slide by accident. Okay, now I meant to, that shouldn't be there. Let's look at a more formal definition of the revenge frame, including colors to highlight the frame element names. An avenger inflicts a punishment on an offender as a consequence of an earlier action by the offender. And the punishment, the earlier action is the injury. The avenger need not be the same as the injured party who suffered the injury, but of course, as we saw, can be. The avenger must share the judgment that the offender's action was wrong. the judgment that the offender had inflicted an injury is made without regard to the law. So it's the avenger's perspective about what's happened and not the institution of law or not the other cultural institutions that are at play. And that's actually key, right? We would never say, I wouldn't say never, but typically we wouldn't say the judge in the sense of revenge, we could not say the judge retaliated against the criminal by sentencing him to 20 years in prison, right? Now, it may be that as a private person, the judge is retaliating, and that, of course, is not within the bounds of the law, right? But for a judge to issue a sentence after a trial and so on, that's not an act of revenge. That's implementing the law in the best way possible, given the judge's understanding of the law, right? So that's a crucial difference. Yesterday I showed you a picture of Valen's description for tie in the attaching frame. I want to show you this table of frame elements and their syntactic realizations so that you know you can go to the FrameNet website and look at information that's been tabulated by the FrameNet software to present its results in more than one way, right? If I remember correctly, two of your examples had null instantiated agents, right? And it was because of the particular syntactic structure of the sentence that a null instantiation was possible. FrameNet calls that constructional null instantiation. We abbreviate it CNI, and although it's the focus of tomorrow's lecture, I'm illustrating it now because it happens to be over here in the top right. It says, Avenger, for which we have 39 example sentences annotated, occurs twice as null instantiation because of the construction. Okay, is that helpful? All right, so this is what a frame element and syntactic realization table looks like. And I think now would be a good place to stop and take a break for